Thank you very much. I think you really, I think I can interpret everybody's opinion that you are really a rarity, you know, from an intellectual point of view, as a scholar and as a human being. I can tell you just, thank you for that. And thank you even to Marco Lamanna, who is now attending. He's a friend of mine, he's now a colleague of mine. He first suggested me to read Benedict Pereira. So, as you know, this talk is on this topic, transubstantiation and the real distinction between essence and existence. And even the concerns of Benedict Pereira. By the way, do you know Benedict Pereira? Who, I mean, it is no. Good to know. Good. So I can briefly introduce you to Benedict Pereira. Marco Lamanna is now there, and he is one of the most really important specialists on Benedict Pereira. Pereira was born in Ruzafa, near Valencia, Spain. He entered the Society of Jesus in 1553, arrived in Italy, where he spent a period in that beautiful country, which is Sicily, and then in Rome, at the Roman College, where he deepens his philosophical studies, becoming professor of rhetoric, philosophy, theology, and sex scriptures, and died in Rome, 1610. Pereira was a profound theologian, but he was above all a great physicist and an excellent philosopher. He criticized the principle of authority as used in the scholastic tradition. His motto was very, very well known, but he rearranged it. Amicus Socrates, amicus Plato, but sed magis amica veritas. He published 5 main works and left a large amount of manuscripts. For the sake of this talk, it is important to remind that his main philosophical work was, and still is, the communibus omnium rerum naturalium principijs et affectionibus, published in 1576, republished on different occasions until 1618. It was a very important work at that time, widely quoted by many philosophers and scientists of his time, including Galileo Galilei himself. Now, the chapter 14 of book 6 of his De Communibus deals with the question of the real distinction between essence and existence, defended, as you perfectly know, by the Thomists and denied by the Jesuits and by Pereira himself, being a Jesuit as well. Now, briefly, you know very well that there is a debate. By the way, I know very well that my talk focuses on the philosophical problem of transubstantiation, but at the same time on the philosophical problem of the real or not real distinction between essence and existence. I know that both are important topics, and perhaps even the topic of real distinction could be interesting for you. I can imagine, after having participated in different talks during this congress. Now, as is well known, this is a philosophical and theological question, that of the real or not real distinction, of great importance, subject of heated debates, at least from the time of Avicenna to the present day. Perhaps you may know that even in contemporary philosophy, at least Peter Gitch, Anthony Kenny, who recently, by the way, changed his mind on the subject, yes, after my translation of his Aquinas into Italian, he wrote a preface where he declared that now he's for that distinction. Okay, so that is a breaking news. Kenny now on the side of, say, of Thomists. Barry Miller, you might know him, and Chris McDaniel, not to mention Julia, have dealt with this issue within contemporary philosophy. Well known in the history of philosophy, as you perfectly know, is the great debate that developed and now confirmed by Catherine Koenig-Pfalung and Pasquale Porro immediately after the death of Thomas Aquinas, not during his life, in the 13th century. Now it is clear, thanks to Catherine Koenig-Pfalung. Also well known in the history of philosophy, the similar debate that took place in the first half of the 20th century between Dominicans and Jesuits. I have written a book on it, by the way, in Italian, unfortunately. Less well known to the community of historians of philosophy was the debate in the 16th century, of which Pereira even is and was a witness. Now, Pereira, at the very beginning of this chapter, calls debate between essence, calls debate on the distinction between essence and existence, and magna disceptatio. He says, magna est disceptatio tam inter philosophes quam inter theologos, and existentia cuius libet rei distinguatur realiter obeius essentia et quiditate. So at that time and nowadays and in medieval time, this topic was a very important topic. By the way, I note that this is not the last version of my paper, but this is not important. Now, Pereira's treatment develops in 3 chapters and divided into 3 parts. In the first, the Jesuit philosopher outlines the arguments of the Thomists. In the second, he presents his arguments. In the third, he replies point by point to the arguments of the Thomists. My exposition shall follow the same layout, focusing on the topic of transubstantiation, which is the most original topic and features of Pereira's treatment and the topic of this Congress as well. Now, the Thomist's opinion and arguments. Pereira does not share the theory or the thesis of Thomists, who were defending, as you know, the real distinction between essence and existence. Nevertheless, before presenting his own position, he quotes, as was common, obviously at the time and now, the text and reference authors of the Thomists, as well as their arguments. The authors mentioned were and are in his work, in addition to Thomas Aquinas himself, also Egidius Romanus, and who famously defended thesis of real distinction, as well as Capreolus and Soncinas. On the Thomist 5 argument, quoted by Pereira, I recall here all the best known, even at the present day, both in the past times and today. I have elsewhere called this the argument of the plurificatio or multiplicatio. In its shortest form, I think we should take the last one, but okay, I try to. I think you have in your email. I send it to you. Now, if existence were not really distinct from essence, there would be only one entity. Now it is evident that there is more than one entity in the world. Ergo, in entities except one, existence is necessarily really distinct from essence. The proof of the major premise is the following: existence is in itself one and identical. Not unique is not the right word. And I quote Thomas Aquinas, and you know perfectly, esse in quantum est esse non potest esse diversum. It can be multiplied and differentiated, consequently, only if there are recipients, namely essences, different from existence and different from each other, which, upon receiving it from God, diversify and multiply existence. Now, concerning our topic, the most important argument is the fourth. It is not found, to my knowledge, in the medieval debate on the same problem, and is instead clearly influenced by the great theological discussions of the Counter-Reformation. The argument develops in these terms. In the new edition, I try to give a better form, logical form to this argument. But by the way, this is how it develops in according to him. If a separation exists, if a separation between existence and essence occurs in accidents, It will similarly also happen in substances. Now, in accidents, it is possible to separate essence from existence. Now, the proof of this is a theological one. For while the essence of the quantity remains in the host after the consecration, its existence does not remain, since the subject to which it belongs, that is the substance of the bread, no longer exists. Ergo, such a separation between existence and essence will similarly also happen in substances in which existence is really distinct from essence. So, as you can see now that the theological fact of so theology is taken here as a factum, as if it were the reality, or is reality, in fact. It is important to notice here that the consecrated host is not taken even as an helpful example to explain the thesis of the separation between essence and existence, but as an incontrovertible theological fact which proves the minor premise of the syllogism. In short, it is implicit that whoever denies this argument would deny transubstantiation itself in the way in which Protestants were denying it. More specifically, the heretical allusion was the following: whoever denies the real distinction between essence of quantity and its existence, namely between the essence of the quantity of species of bread and the existence of the same quantity of species of bread, would be forced, Thomists argued at that time against the Jesuits, to admit the permanence of the subject of the inherence of this species, that is the permanence of the substance of the bread. Yet this was precisely what the Lutherans were advocating when they denied transubstantiation and defended consubstantiation. Okay. Now, Pereira's opinion and arguments. Pereira begins to illustrate his position by quoting some philosophers and theologians who have criticized the thesis, the theory of the real distinction. Henry of Kent, Duns Scotus, as you know, Durand of San Proziano, William of Ockham, and Ali quam plurimi. Now, it is important to me to notice that Pereira does not mention Thomas Aquinas himself explicitly. However, exposing his own personal position, Pereira refers to Aquinas as twice, while keeping silent about those of the aforementioned authors. As we shall see, his position is closer to that of Thomas Aquinas than it seems at first sight. And this was perfectly clear to Pereira himself, and was part of his strategy to use Thomas Aquinas implicitly in order to reply to the so-called Thomists at that time. Now, Pereira exposed 7 arguments in support of his theory, according to which existence and essence are not really distinct creatures, entities, or creatures. I recall here only the first, which is important to me. Existence is a transcendental, like being one, true, and good. In fact, it does not mean some accidental reality or property added to a particular kind of entity in order to characterize them, but means a property that pervades, or every kind of entity that follows every entity, showing itself as is concomitance, as you know. Therefore, it is not a property that means some reality other than what is predicated of, as for example happens in the case of wise, predicated of Socrates, which refers to a property different, stricto sensu, from the subject Socrates itself. Now, what is important now for us is the argument or the answers, or Pereira answers to Thomas' argument, Thomas' argument. Pereira's answer to the 4th argument quoted above, based on transubstantiation, develops in the theological field. Pereira denies that the existence of quantity, that is the existence of the species of bread and wine, fails in the consecration, and denies that only the essence of quantity remains. It is the essence of the species of the bread and wine. He argues that the existence, and this is perhaps the most important thing within his argument, he argues that the existence of something cannot fail without the annihilation or disappearance, the annihilation of the essence of which it is existence. In this case, the existence of the species of quantity cannot fail without the annihilation of the same essence of species of quantity, which is the species of the substance bread and of the substance wine. Now, therefore, that was the premise, the premise of his argument, which is quite strange to me. Therefore, if the existence of the species of bread and wine failed, the essence themselves, that is to say, the very species of bread and wine, would, according to him, have to disappear with it, and then be immediately, as a consequence, regenerated and therefore recreated. Now, from a theological point of view, this argument does not work, Pereira notes, for something must remain in the consecration in order for the words of Jesus to be true, meaningful, and effective. These, and not something different recreated on the spot, is my body. In short, in order for that bread to be transubstantiated into the body of Christ, it is necessary that precisely that bread, at least in its species, that is in its quantity, remains both in its essence and in its existence. So, Pereira. Therefore, Pereira returned in a way to send the suspicion of heresy that crept into the Thomist argument. Nothing the following: if there is a theory that would not allow us to explain transubstantiation, it is that of the Thomists, that is the thesis of the real distinction between essence and existence, since it would have jeopardized the meaning of the words, this is my body. By the way, to be honest, I find quite odd and strange the fact that the premise of his argument is a criticism of the doctrine of the real distinction. That is to say, in order to demonstrate that the distinction is not real, he presupposes that the distinction is not real. So, okay, from a theological point of view, it is interesting, but in order to introduce his argument, he, even as a kind of premise, he says that the existence of something cannot fail without the annihilation of the essence of which it is existence. And so, but this is exactly what has to be demonstrated, so that it is a petitio principii, I do think, in a way. Even though from a theological point of view, he really answered to those Thomists or theologians, because he noticed that that would be an heresy as well, according to this theory. So far, so good. Now, what is interesting to me, to be honest, is the theater, in a way, of all these different people all around. So, was really Pereira against Aquinas or not? Okay, this is, I think, interesting to me. I think is a kind of theater of characteristic and of, yeah. This is a reason why my comments on Pereira's position are of philological, philosophical, and theological natures, and I think some of you can be interested in this topic. As we have seen, Pereira apparently presents himself as a defender of the Jesuit thesis against the Thomist thesis. However, it is evident, and was clear even to Pereira himself, as I have demonstrated elsewhere, that his position was by no means far from Thomas' position, at least in some texts. On the contrary, the position of the so-called Thomists at that time referred, not Pereira, to the position of Avicenna, or at least of the Avicennian Thomas, that is, of the young Thomas, whereas his own position referred to the Aristotelian Thomists. Now, let me now explain to you something. Thomas Aquinas, as far as I have understood him, was very sympathetic to each author, so that when he commented on Liber de Causa, it seems that he is a Neoplatonist. Whereas when he commented on Aristotle, he seemed to be a pure Aristotelian. Now, and by the way, at that time, there was not the problem of copyright. This is a modern problem. For him, the main purpose was to explain the common theological doctrine, so that within his work, we can find Neoplatonic thoughts and theories, even and Aristotelian theories. So the coherence and the consistency of his philosophy was not the main purpose of his work, and copyright was not really, or be original in a way. It is something which is typical modern. So now the most challenging thing when we read Thomas Aquinas is to find, say, the theory or some passages which are typical of them. You know, and this is difficult because everything he wrote is not really pure and only Thomist, or pure and only Thomas Aquinas. You know, so I personally found it and discovered that I think some features, some Aristotelian features, are the most original features of his metaphysics. And one proof of that is that the condemnation of Thomas Aquinas after his death, 1277, were only about some Aristotelian theories of Thomas Aquinas. So that could be the typical features of him as recognized at his time. So that was a parenthesis. Now let me quote something about this topic. For example, consider Pereira's argument against the real distinction I mentioned above, namely that of the transcendentals. In Thomas Aquinas himself, we find a very similar argument, which was very clearly present to him. Thomas noticed that if essence and being, now I translate being or existence, I can then clarify that in our discussion. If essence and being were really distinct, then the corresponding terms essence and being would have to designate realities that were distinct, re. However, the Thomas texts on the topic quoted by all the Thomists who do not share the belief that distinction is real are quite clear. The terms denote the same reality but expresses different senses. Now let me take the verb denote and the verb express in the Fregean sense, okay, as you perfectly know. Hence, the term being, which is applied to a thing by reason of its very existence, designates, in terms of denotes, we can also say today, after Frege, designates or denotes the same thing as the term which is applied to it by reason of its essence. This is very important, I think, for this discussion. Furthermore, it is well known that the transcendental res is derived from the quiddity or essence, while the term ens is derived from the act of being. Now, Thomas lays down clearly that the terms ens and res signify the same reality while expressing different rationes, or I would suggest, I suggested in my last book to translate these rationes in terms of senses. I quote, I don't know, but I like quoting Thomas Aquinas. I don't know why. because Thomists and Aquinas and not Thomists. It is also evident from the foregoing argument that unity and being are the same numerically, but different in ratione. I don't translate ratione because it's very difficult translation. Ratione doesn't mean at all ideas or subjective notions. Please don't do it. But this is how all translations sound. Different ratione has been translated in terms of different by means of notions, by means of ideas. But notions and ideas nowadays in our modern philosophy mean something which is subjective, which was completely absent in Thomas' text. For if this were not the case, they would be wholly synonymous, and then it would be nonsense to say a human being and one man. You know very well, by the way, this text. I know that. For it must be borne in mind that the term man is derived from the quiddity of the nature of man, and the term thing rests from the quiddity only. But the term being is derived from the act of being, and the term one from order or lack of division, for what is one is an undivided being. Now, what has an essence and a quiddity by reason of that essence, and what is undivided in itself are the same. Hence, these three, think, being, and one, res, ens, and unum, signify or denote, I can say, absolutely the same thing, but according to different rationes. Does that mean that the distinction between essence and being is only a distinction of reason in modern terms? Not at all, as I've demonstrated elsewhere, since the expression different ratione in Aquinas means often something similar to different in definition, also objectively, because ratio in this context is the translation of logos. Okay, this is really literally the translation of logos doesn't mean idea in modern terms, something which is subjective, but this is another story. Now, second point, according to the relationship between Pereira, Thomas Aquinas, and the Thomists, regarding the argument according to which the existence of something cannot fail without the annihilation of the essence of which it is existence, there is again a very similar argument in Thomas Aquinas, even not quoted by Pereira, but was surely present to him. This following, it is the same thing to say, man and one man. By the way, that seems to be Aristotle, but it's Thomas Aquinas commenting on him. Okay. Now, and similarly, it is the same thing to say human being and the thing that is man, and nothing different is expressed when in speaking we repeat the term saying this is a human being, a man, and one man. Aristotle proves this as follows. And Thomas Aquinas follows him. It is the same thing for man and the thing that is man to be generated and corrupted. By the way, this was one of the main arguments of Anthony Kenny against the real distinction at the time of his Aquinas on being. This is evident from the fact that generation is a process toward being, and corruption a change from being to non-being. Hence, a man is never generated without a human being being generated, nor is a man ever corrupted without a human being being corrupted. And those things which are generated and corrupted together are themselves one and the same. By the way, I think this is a very important argument even on the topic of this Congress, because it is always the matter of generation and corruption and annihilation or not. I think this could be really a very important argument, even not only for essential features, but even for accidental features. In this passage where Thomas is following Aristotle's doctrine to the letter, it is clear that there is no difference between the actual being of Socrates and the being a man of Socrates, or, which is the same thing, between the actual being of a man and his being a man. In fact, for when a man is generated, by the very fact his being is generated, and when a man dies, his being dies too, and vice versa. This is Thomas Aquinas. This is not, I mean, Cotus or I don't know. This is Thomas Aquinas. By the way, the commentary by Thomas Aquinas on Aristotle belongs to the last part of his academic career. So in a way, his last word, not at the time of the antithesis. Then the third point is the following one, regarding Pereira's theological argument, according to which it is necessary that something remain in the consecration in order for the words of Jesus to be true, meaningful, and effective. This is my body. We found in Thomas Aquinas a very similar argument. Again, it is interesting because, in fact, he is defending the so-called Jesuitic position, but in fact, his background is Thomas Aquinas. Again, it is interesting to me, being a Sicilian, the country of Pirandello. Oh, that is to say, who is who? So, you know, uno nessuno centomila. This is Pereira a Thomist? Is Pereira a Jesuit? Because he's all the time quoting Thomas Aquinas, even implicit, twice explicitly, but he is against the Thomists. Perhaps the doctrinal relationship between Thomists and Thomas Aquinas was not so pure in a way. Now, the last argument. In this way, of course, it is clear that in the aforesaid conversion, that is according to Thomas Aquinas, of bread into the body of Christ, there is not a common subject persisting after the conversion, since a transmutation takes place in the first subject, and this is a principle of individuation. It is necessary to follow that something persists to make true the words, "This is my body." This is literally what Pereira maintained. The very words, in fact, which are significant and effective of this conversion. And the substance of the bread does not persist, neither does any prior matter, as was shown. Therefore, one necessarily says that what persists is other than substance of the bread. Of this sort, of course, is the accident of the bread. Therefore, the accidents of the bread do persist even after the conversion mentioned. This is interesting in order to reconstruct the library, so to speak, of Pereira himself. So let me now try some conclusion and one meta conclusion which could be useful for some journalists in this case. The real distinction between essence and existence does not help, or it seems, much metaphysically or theologically in understanding the Eucharist. The position of Pereira, which is important to me, and the Jesuit, was not very far, at least from that of some texts of Thomas. Okay. Of course, this is not the place to investigate in depth this very complicated question, even though I'm very interested in it still. And then let me conclude with some meta-philosophical, if you prefer, sociological comments. This Congress seems to be only for Catholic philosophy. That could be useful for some journalists now who believe in the Eucharist. The philosophical method practiced in this Congress is not far from that of many medieval theologians, such as Thomas Aquinas himself. It is true philosophy that is practiced in this Congress. Is Bertrand Russell's accusation against Thomas Aquinas valid for this Congress? Do you remember? Yeah, obviously, some of you. There is a little of the true philosophic spirit in Aquinas. It does not, like the Platonic Socrates, set out to follow wherever the argument might lead. he is not engaged in an inquiry, the result of which it is impossible to know in advance. Before he begins to philosophize, or we begin to philosophize, he already knows the truth. The truth, it is declared in the Catholic faith. If he can find apparently rational arguments for some parts of the faith, so much the better. If he cannot, he need only fall back on revelation. Finding of arguments for a conclusion given in advance is not philosophy, but spatial plating. I cannot therefore feel that he deserves to put on a level with the best philosophers either of Greece or of modern times. By the way, Anthony Kenny wrote his history of philosophy because of that, because he thought that it was worthwhile to write something about medieval philosophy as well. And by the way, do you know the so-called history without gaps? Yeah, nowadays of Adamson, he is now, yeah. Okay, was Russell right? According to what I have heard and said so far, the accusation seems fully incorrect to me. So far, simulated by the dogma of the Eucharist, we have done nothing but deepen the themes such as substance and accidents, essence and existence. These are typical topics of Aristotle's philosophy as well as of contemporary metaphysics. So if Aristotle's philosophy was true philosophy, why can't it be what we are practicing here? There is another point to make. I think analytic philosophers, as you perfectly know, often use thoughts as experiments. They imagine not existent situation in order to better argue philosophically. Now, why is it legitimate to imagine possible and non-existent worlds of the non-existence of which everyone is very convinced, but not legitimate to believe in the existence of the body and blood of Christ in the Eucharist, something that is absolutely existent and true for millions of people around the world? The thing that completely escapes many secular so-called philosophers, I think, is an uncontroverted fact in the history of philosophy. Faith, whether Islamic or Christian, Catholic or Reformed, has been a very effective laboratory of purely philosophical notions and debates, including most of the religiously so-called neutral philosophical debates of our day, such as contemporary debates on the notion of existence nowadays. Without religion, I do think philosophy loses one of its most effective laboratories. Now, coming back to our Jesuit Pereira, indeed, he aimed to defend the Catholic faith and transubstantiation thanks to philosophy. In particular, thanks to a philosophical criticism of the thesis of the real distinction between essence and existence. But he also aimed to philosophically defend philosophical thesis thanks to a theological laboratory, namely the case of the Eucharist. Thank you for your attention.
So the funny, yeah, so for the participants on Zoom, it'll be more natural if I speak like this,
Yeah.
but it's a bit weird to be talking to you by way of.
Share the screen.
Okay.
Just share your screen. So you're in front of us, we're in front of them. Okay.
We don't need to talk to each other through a server in California.
I can speak with that Giovanni, and I will.
Okay. So first of all, thank you. This is really interesting, and there was a lot for me to think about it. And I just wanted to, I guess, say something and then ask a question. I agree with you. I mean, it's really fun beating up on Russell on this point, isn't it, about the history of philosophy? And I always think that if there's a prime example, actually, of special pleading in the history of philosophy, it's the Principia Mathematica, which takes it on faith that mathematics is reducible to logic. So whereas Aquinas also took some things on faith, but at least it could be said for him that he managed to prove what he set out to prove. That's my remark. But my question, I think, is probably much more important. I wanted to ask about what you were saying about rational difference and difference in ratio, in part because this is I think the word that we've all struggled with, in translation or even just understanding kind of the text and things. And if I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying that the thought, like even a concept or a notion or an idea, has this kind of subjective ring to it in the way that we think about these things, and that in medieval philosophy it is certainly not that. And I get that, but I think I'm wondering about this, sort of, if I may use some modern terminology, like extension versus intention, And it's certainly true that, you know, the man Socrates and the animal capable of laughter, you know, that you see in front of you, that they're extensionally identical, right? They occupy the same space and all that. They have all the same kind of properties. So I'm wondering about the role, I mean, difference in ratio has to be objective and therefore sort of mind independent, but it also is something that's only sort of recognizable for us in our minds. So I guess I want to ask for you, how is this a question of merely of translation, or is this a question also of thinking about the intention versus extension, or these differences in ratio? How do you construe this? And am I making sense? Am I thinking in the right lines along these? Is extension versus intention even the right way to think about it? If these rationes don't exist merely in our minds, or they sort of exist in our minds and out of them? Please help me. I'm confused. But not by your presentation, of course. It's very clear. I find it very difficult.
Thank you so much for this question. Yeah, really. I have judged with this topic, and at least in two of my books, and there is an appendix in my last Aquinas of the Frege, publicity again. Sorry. In the appendix, I really went in depth in this. But okay, all in all, Thomas Aquinas and Scotus as well, because Scotus developed exactly because of the ambiguity of the expression different ratione. Scotus, please correct me if I am wrong. He developed his Howen theory because the expression different ratione in Thomas Aquinas is a little bit ambiguous. It's not very clear, and he uses this expression, different ratione, in three different cases. First of all, nomina Dei, so properties of God. And by the way, he changed his mind, clearly changed his mind in this case, because at the very beginning, he was convinced that the difference between God's properties is a different ratione. But he added at the very beginning or in his commentary on sentence that this difference is on the side of God, is as difference, not as a unique fundament, but is the difference as such is on the side of God. Otherwise, the nomina divina, the nomina Dei would be synonym, okay? This is the first case. Now, second case, transcendentals, as we have seen, the difference between different transcendental properties is a differentia ratione, ablati. So now, and then subject and predicate. Very interesting. So Socrates is wise. The difference between Socrates and wisdom, and the wisdom of Socrates, is a differentia ratio. So this is a very important concept and notion of his entire metaphysics. Now, obviously, the way how we translate this expression is decisive. So, but the only thing I can see, I can say after having read Frege is that the most correct way to translate this expression is they are identical, they denote the same thing, but from different point of view or in different senses. Now, in Frege himself, it is clear that senses or sense is something which is in between. It is not even clear in Frege himself. This is to say, it is not exactly the reality, what happens, so to speak, in the reality outside there, but it is something which is not purely subjective. And this ambiguity is very important for Thomas Aquinas in order to not answer to some very metaphysical. That is to say that I find really Scotus' position consistent, much more consistent than that of Thomas Aquinas. But it is sure that ratione in this case, just in this case, different ratione according to Thomas is not something. It's not to do, I think, with extension or intention. I I think just that within the reality, we have to distinguish something, okay? But not so much that the unity of a thing will disappear.
May I
So different forms, perhaps.
Yeah, I have a quick follow-up question because I really like the connection with Frege, and I spent a lot of time thinking about Frege's, Frege and the medievals, and but I guess I just maybe I'm wrong, but I think that I can't shake this thought that at least for Frege, there's this, these concepts or these propositional contents, like they just exist, and I kind of sort of wonder what's our role, and the answer is kind of we don't have one, right? They live their merry lives, like the Epicurean gods, and I think that there's something different going on in the scholastic thinkers in terms of the way that we interact with these things. They're not merely out there, that we have some role too to play. We don't create them, and I don't know. I'm struggling with this.
We are not created them. But for example, the difference between the expression, the morning star, the evening star, which is a different outside there, or a different, in sense. But what does it mean that they are different in sense? Without human beings, could this difference be existence in the real world outside there or not? Okay. In Frege, this question, I think, remains open, but it is sure that he really underlined the fact that it's not just purely ideas. It's not a matter of pure ideas. It is very clear of imagination. So something similar happened to this expression, different razione in Thomists and Aquinas, not purely on the side of reality, but surely not on the side of subject. It's not just a matter of our understanding.
It's not purely intentional.
But I think because this expression in Thomists and Aquinas is really ambiguous.
Okay, that helps. At least it helps me to see that some of my confusions aren't based on a misunderstanding. Yeah, thank you, though. I should clear out of the seat. Thank you.
Any other questions at this point, or anything to follow up on this? Would you come out, David? Thank you.
Thank you for this delightful paper.
And greetings for me.
So, you know that you've disarmed me in advance, because if I appeal to an early work, then Aquinas has changed his mind, and if I appeal to a work that's a commentary on Aristotle, then it's it's an Aristotelian point. So, but nonetheless, I have to appeal to a text of Aquinas, and it's difficult always to appeal to what I call personal work. So I do appeal to the commentary on Boethius, the De Hebdomadibus, which of course you know very well. And I think it's the best text that I can think of where it's the only text maybe, where he's very, very clear on the difference between the conceptual distinction and what we call a real distinction, which doesn't mean what it came to mean, separable in reality, but that's why I prefer extramental distinction. But Aquinas says, so sometimes there's a distinction, a participation of quod est or ens in being, which he says is intentional only. Another word for it, in intentione, or another word for it is in ratione. But when we analyze a thing and give an argument, his conclusion is, and now we have a difference in re. So what I submit is, if we go over that passage, if you just look at the words, and again, he's commenting on Boethius, but really, this is not Boethius. So in fact, I think I would submit, it's interesting, even Avicenna, because you say, well, all you want to do is talk about Avicenna, but Avicenna does not have, he has divine simplicity. This is why the divine is not even a Mawjud, because that would introduce complexity. For Avicenna, he's very much in this, and Maimonides are in the Platonic discourse. When you have form, you have a difference in re. right? When you have the Platonic forms are, each of them are different. So human and animal, they're different forms, right? I think in certain ways for Scotus, human and animal are formally distinct. They're extramentally distinct. But for Aquinas, no, he's quite explicit that animal is a way of looking at the same thing that we're looking at when we say human. And in a human being, there's human and animal are only conceptually distinct because animal is part of being a human. So I just submit to you that for the transcendental terms, they're conceptually distinct in ratione, but they're not yet distinct in re without further argumentations. This is why we need an argument, why there must be a distinction between esse, and we have to distinguish different senses of esse that is distinct in re from quod est, and that's what's given in the Dante. What's given in the Dante is this very long. It's the longest because I've cataloged the arguments. You've read my paper, but it's just there's many catalogs. But some people say there's 6 arguments. Pereira has 5 arguments, so I cataloged 9 arguments. But the longest of all the arguments is from the De Hebdomadibus. I don't think it's a great argument myself, but still, and it says the conclusion of that argument that he says, okay, it's not just distinct in re between quod est and esse, but not distinct in ratione or in intenzione, but distinct in re. So there you have a kind of proof text to question your.
Yeah, thank you. Your reaction.
But that's not a refutation.
Yeah. Now, what can I say? Do you think it is correct to translate different ratione in terms of differ conceptually? Because you use this expression conceptually. Conceptually reminds me today to something even which sounds subjective after the modern philosophy, no? But I think that in terms of Aquinas it is clear, and that was the reason why the Scots then exactly commenting on this part of Thomas Aquinas work developed his idea of the distinctio ex parte reo, because it is clear to me that there are 3 distinctions. First of all, an extramental distinction, then second, a subjective distinction, but then there is another distinction in between, which is between an extramental and a purely subjective. And this is the case of God's properties, of transcendental properties, and of subject and predicates. And if we translate conceptually, then we have to explain why all these names are not synonyma. Because synonyma is exactly as a bank, so that they note the same thing.
This little note, if I may add, okay? Since you brought in some semantic ideas into this, I think it might be the easiest to put the point in terms of using the medieval semantical notions of signification and supposition. And so when we are talking, if you look at that passage, and this is also in answer to Boaz's question about why the transcendentals are non-synonymous, even if they are extensionally the same. They are all the same supposita. They are all universally applicable to all things. It is because the supposita are common, but their significata are different, and the same goes for ens, res, aliquid, unum, etc. Because their significata are different. That is, and that is the ratio on account of which these terms apply to the supposita, and that is the ratio that we objectively conceive by means of our objective concepts by forming the subjective mental acts, if we are thinking correctly. So it's not a subjective matter, but of course, it takes our subjective activities for us as cognitive subjects to become aware of these. And it's now to get back to David's example.
I just want you to notice that Jula just erased all the English translations and substituted Latin.
Yeah.
Very nice.
Yes, because the original Latin makes more sense than any of the English translations that carry their own modern baggage that makes for confusion. So, and when it comes to the business about the non-synonymous character of animal and man, it is in the case of men, the form signified in this or that individual human is signified once as humanity, once as animality, under the more or less specific concepts. And how come they are non-synonymous? Because animal, being not so specific, a generic concept can apply also to animals that are not rational. So animality can be identical with dogginess, cattiness, whatnot, affinity, which is where I can stop with this affinity. Okay, so please, Richard, take over.
I'm talking to you. So this is really just a comment, but I was very interested by what you were saying about the lack of homogeneity, let's say, amongst the various schools, let's say the Jesuits and the Thomists. And in the 16th and 17th century, there are some things, there are some things to remember. One is the Jesuits were mandated by their foundation to study Thomas Aquinas. The other is that even amongst the Thomists, there were vast differences. And I'll give you one example. Right? This is, I think, Thomas Aquinas' view that when matter and form are united, there's nothing other than the matter and the form there. Okay, it's an immediate, they're just apt to fit together. Right? Scotus' view is this: you need an extra thing, a relation. Okay. Now, if you think about the Jesuits, they have a big debate. Is one relation sufficient, or do you need two, one in matter, one in form? The Thomists have the following debate: which of those two views is correct? And most of the Spanish Thomists say, no, you need an extra relation to unite them, and then try to find texts in Aquinas that will do that. And then the other half of them, mainly Italian ones, say, no, look at this text from Aquinas on the sentences. He says you don't need anything extra. They're just naturally apt to fit together. But, you know, if you think who's the most important Thomists, who are the most important Thomists in the 17th century, you think the Salmanticenses, the Complutenses down in Spain, they rigidly adopt Scotus' view on the matter and then try to say that it's in Aquinas.
Yeah, you probably know. Yeah, but yeah.
That was very useful. Thank you very much. Okay. We are over time a little bit, so unless there are any urgent further questions, I would say we should conclude our business for now until we return at 6 Budapest time for the lecture. And with this, we can close the session today. Thank you very much, Giovanni.
Thank you.
Thank you for the audience, for the participation.